Kieran Blackwood stood over the sleeping woman, ruler gripped in his gloved hand like a weapon, his steel-gray eyes burning with cold fury. What exactly was he about to do with that stick? And how did a broke cleaning lady end up passed out in the private chair of Chicago's most dangerous mafia boss, a man who fires people for leaving coffee stains? A man so obsessed with control that he wears gloves just to shake hands? The answer to that question will take you somewhere you never expected. Because what happens next between these two people from completely different worlds isn't just going to surprise you, it's going to flip everything you think you know upside down. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where this whole nightmare began. 3 days earlier, in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. If this story touched your heart, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe in love again. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another story that will make you laugh, cry, and believe in second chances. 3 days earlier, Cassie Reyes sat motionless on a hard plastic chair in room 47 at Chicago Memorial Hospital. Her hand clutched her mother's hand, the same hand that had cooked so many meals for her, that had wiped away her tears every time she fell, and now lay helpless on a white sheet, thin and ice-cold. Rosa Reyes had been in a coma for 2 days. Cancer was gnawing at her body day by day, hour by hour, and Cassie could do nothing but sit there, watch the heart monitor's line rise and dip in steady waves, listen to the hollow beep-beep of the machines, and pray. The sharp sting of disinfectant hit the back of her throat, a smell she'd come to know too well over these past months. The smell of hospitals, of waiting, of fear. The door opened, and Dr. Patterson walked in, his face carrying that gravity Cassie had learned to read after dozens of meetings. He pulled up a chair across from her, a thick file in his hands. He said there was good news and bad news. The good news was that the experimental treatment was working. The tumor had stopped growing, and was even showing signs of shrinking. Cassie almost cried with relief, but then Dr. Patterson kept going. He said, however, they needed surgery to remove the primary tumor within a week, or the window of opportunity would close. Cassie said, then do the surgery. What are we waiting for? Dr. Patterson was silent for a moment, then said the hospital required payment of at least half the cost before they could proceed, and that half was $150,000. $150,000. The number rang through Cassie's head like a death knell. She waited tables at a diner for $12 an hour. She worked evening shifts for a cleaning company for $15 an hour. Working 80 hours a week, she brought home around $2,500 a month after rent and living expenses. $150,000 divided by $2,500 came to 60 months. 5 years. She'd need 5 years to earn that kind of money. But her mother had 1 week. Dr. Patterson added something about financial assistance programs, about negotiating with the hospital, but Cassie couldn't hear him anymore. She only looked at her mother lying there, unmoving, and felt the world collapse beneath her feet. 20 minutes later, Tiffany found Cassie in the small chapel on the hospital's first floor. The room was empty except for an elderly woman in the front pew, murmuring prayers in Spanish. Cassie sat in the far back corner, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking in waves. Tiffany didn't say anything. She just sat beside her and set 2 cups of hot coffee on the bench. After a while, Cassie lifted her head, eyes raw and red, and told Tiffany everything. $150,000. 1 week. Tiffany listened, sighed, and said Cassie needed another job, more money, and fast. Cassie gave a bitter laugh and said she was already working 3 jobs, sleeping 4 hours a day. What else did Tiffany want her to do? Tiffany pulled out her phone and said her cousin worked for Morrison Cleaning Services, a company that cleaned high-end buildings downtown. They paid $25 an hour plus overtime, and they were always hiring because the work was brutal and most people quit after a few weeks. $25 an hour, nearly double what Cassie was making. Cassie did the math in her head. Even if she added 40 hours a week there, on top of her current jobs, she still couldn't make $150,000 in 1 week, but at least she could earn enough to negotiate with the hospital, to beg for more time, to keep her mother alive 1 more day. She asked Tiffany to send her the cousin's phone number. Tiffany nodded and texted immediately, but then she took Cassie's hand and told her Cassie had to promise she'd eat at least 1 proper meal a day and take vitamins, because if Cassie got sick, who would look after Aunt Rosa? Cassie nodded, and they clasped hands the way they used to when they were 10 years old, making simple promises, like splitting a bag of candy or keeping each other's secrets. Cassie stood, drained the cup of coffee that had gone cold, and walked out of the chapel. She moved down the long, endless hallway, past closed patient room doors, past the anxious faces of families keeping vigil, and went back to her mother's room. Standing outside the door, she looked through the small window at her mother lying there, and she whispered to herself that no matter what she had to do, she'd do it. No matter what it cost, she'd pay it. 3 weeks passed like a whirlwind. Cassie started at Morrison Cleaning Services on the second day after her conversation with Tiffany, and from that moment on, she almost forgot what it felt like to rest. The company's night shift was assigned to high-end office buildings in the Loop, the heart of downtown Chicago, where glass towers rose like fortresses built for the wealthy. Cassie mopped veined marble floors, polished stainless steel elevator doors until they shone, and scrubbed restrooms so spotless you could see your face in them. She didn't complain. She didn't sigh. She just kept her head down, worked, and took the money. After 3 weeks of grinding without a single day off, her supervisor called her into the office and told her she'd been assigned to Blackwood Tower, a 70-story building planted in the middle of the financial district. A coworker of hers, a middle-aged woman named Maria, heard the news and went wide-eyed. Maria said that building, that boss in there is crazy. He's obsessed with cleanliness in a way that's downright sick. And just last month, 5 people got fired, including one who got cut loose for leaving a fingerprint on a glass door. Cassie only shrugged. She needed the money. She needed the overtime hours. She needed every cent she could earn to pay her mother's hospital bills. Her mother had woken up after surgery, and the hospital had agreed to a payment plan after Cassie dropped to her knees and begged, but the debt still hung over her like a blade suspended above her head, waiting to fall. On that fateful night, Cassie started her day at 6 o'clock in the morning with a waitressing shift at the diner, running plates nonstop until 2 in the afternoon. She wolfed down half a leftover sandwich from a customer, then rushed to her second cleaning job, working from 3 in the afternoon until 8 at night. With no time for dinner, she hurried to Blackwood Tower to begin the night shift at 9. 16 hours straight, an empty stomach, eyes burning from lack of sleep. But she kept going, floor after floor, wiping, vacuuming, buffing, until the clock struck 2 in the morning, and she stood in front of the private office door on the 70th floor, Kieran Blackwood's office. She pushed the door open and nearly forgot how to breathe. The room was as vast as a ballroom, with a soaring ceiling and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Chicago at night. The city lights glittered below like a diamond carpet unfurled all the way to the horizon. Everything in the office was minimalist, cold, and so clean it felt sterile, as if no human being had ever truly lived here. Cassie cleaned quickly, wiped the desk, vacuumed the carpet, polished the glass, checked every small corner to make sure she didn't leave behind a single speck of dust. By the time she finished, her body was at its limit. Her knees trembled, her hands were numb, and her eyes felt full of sand. She started to leave, but then her gaze caught on the Italian leather chair behind the desk. Big and plush, wrapped in glossy dark brown leather, it looked like a throne in a kingdom of glass and steel. It seemed to call to her, to whisper that she should sit down, just for a minute, just long enough to breathe. Cassie told herself it'd only be 5 minutes. No one came to the office at this hour. She sat, her body sinking into the soft leather, and her eyes closed before she even realized it. She was wrong. At 3:15 in the morning, the private elevator opened with a soft chime Cassie didn't hear. Kieran Blackwood stepped into his office in the dark. His tall frame, 6'2", cut in stark relief against the city glow pouring through the glass. He flicked on the lights and went perfectly still. Someone was sitting in his chair. No, not just sitting, sleeping, dead asleep in his chair, head tipped to one side, one arm hanging loose, the cleaning cart left sprawled beside it with the bucket and mop scattered like its owner had finally surrendered to life. Kieran's jaw locked so hard his teeth ached. Hayes, his head of security, appeared at his shoulder only seconds later, ready to handle it. Hayes said he'd drag her out immediately, but Kieran lifted a hand, a silent stop. He told Hayes to bring him a ruler, something long and hard. Hayes knew better than anyone not to question his boss, so he only nodded and vanished. 2 minutes later, Hayes returned with a long wooden ruler, and Kieran sent everyone out. Alone in the office with the sleeping intruder, Kieran slowly pulled on his black leather gloves, one finger at a time, then advanced on the chair with the ruler gripped in his hand like a weapon. He used the tip to press into the girl's shoulder, not hard, but firm and unmistakable. Cassie jerked awake, eyes wide with panic, her heart kicking wildly against her ribs as she saw the shadow of a tall man towering over her, face carved from ice, steel gray eyes staring at her as if she were a filthy insect that had crawled into his sacred space. Kieran spoke in a flat, cold voice and said she was sitting in his chair. Cassie sprang up like she'd been shocked, stammering apologies over and over. She was sorry. She didn't mean it. She'd only meant to rest for 5 minutes. But Kieran didn't react to her apologies. He just stood there, watching her with an unreadable gaze, cold and distant, like she was speaking a language he didn't understand and couldn't be bothered to learn. Cassie tried to explain. Said she'd worked 16 straight hours. She was exhausted. She'd only sat down for a second, and then slipped into sleep without realizing it. Kieran cut her off and said that wasn't his problem. She'd violated his private space, and she was fired. Desperate, Cassie began to tell him about her mother, about the cancer, about $150,000 in hospital bills, about working 3 jobs at once just to keep her mother alive one more day. She told him everything, spilling every weight, crushing her shoulders at the feet of this stranger, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he'd understand. But Kieran only looked at her with eyes like steel and said everyone had their own problems. What made her think hers mattered to him? Cassie stood there, staring at the man in front of her, and something inside her shifted. The fear dissolved. The desperation drained away. In its place came fire, a fire she hadn't known she still had. Instead of dropping to her knees the way so many others surely had before a man like this, Cassie straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and met his cold, gray stare head-on. She said she didn't think she was special. She only thought she was a human being trying to save her mother, and if he wanted to fire her, then fire her. But he shouldn't expect her to kneel and beg. She'd never begged anyone for anything in her life, and she wasn't going to start with him. Silence. The room fell so utterly quiet. Cassie could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. Kieran watched her, and for the first time in this exchange, his eyes changed. Not pure cold anymore, but something else glinting in them. Something Cassie couldn't name. Chicago's entire mafia empire trembled before this man. Killers, politicians, billionaires, all of them bowed their heads to him. Yet this cleaning woman, with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn heart, dared to stand straight and look him in the eye without a tremor. Kieran told her to leave, his voice still cold, but he didn't call security, didn't threaten her. He simply ordered her out. Cassie bent down, snatched up her supplies, shoved the cart toward the elevator, and stepped inside. As the doors began to close, she turned back for one last look. Kieran Blackwood was still standing there in the office, flooded with light, those steel gray eyes never leaving her until the metal doors sealed shut. There was something glinting behind that cold steel gaze, something she couldn't name, something dangerous. The next morning, Cassie had barely stepped out of the bathroom in her tiny apartment when her phone rang. Morrison Cleaning Services flashed on the screen, and she knew at once it wasn't going to be good. Her manager's voice on the other end was icy, telling her, "Miss Reyes, your contract is terminated effective immediately for violating client policy." Cassie tried to explain, tried to plead for one chance, but the manager only said the decision had been made and there was nothing further to discuss, then hung up. $25 an hour, the most important source of income she had, gone in a call that lasted less than a minute. Cassie sank onto the edge of the bed, the phone still in her hand, staring at the dark screen as if it might offer her an answer. But there was no answer. Only silence, and darkness slowly, patiently swallowing her whole. That afternoon, after her shift at the diner, Cassie went to the hospital to see her mother. Rosa was still there, eyes sealed shut, her face more hollow than it had been only days earlier, her skin pale as paper, the machines around her threaded with wires and tubing. Dr. Patterson came in, while Cassie was sitting by the bed. He looked at her with an expression that was both compassionate and firm, and said, "Miss Reyes, we need an answer about the payment. You have 5 days. 5 days. $150,000. And she'd just lost the only job that could have moved her even an inch closer to that number." Cassie nodded at the doctor, fighting to keep her voice steady, saying she understood, she'd find a way. When Dr. Patterson left, Cassie turned back to her mother. She took Rosa's thin hand in hers, felt the cold, dry skin beneath her fingers. Tears began to slide down her cheeks, and she didn't even bother to wipe them away. She whispered to her mother, telling her, "I'm sorry, Mama. I tried as hard as I could, but I don't know what to do anymore." Rosa didn't answer. There was only the steady beep-beep of the heart monitor, a cruel reminder that time was draining away 1 second at a time. Cassie stepped out into the hospital corridor, found a plastic chair tucked into a shadowed corner, and collapsed into it. Her head fell into her hands, her shoulders shaking in uneven waves. For the first time in all of her 27 years, Cassie Reyes felt like quitting. She'd fought her whole life, from being a kid raised by a single mother in a poor neighborhood, to working every kind of job just to keep herself afloat through college. She'd never gone down. But now, sitting in a cold hospital hallway with $150,000 pressing on her shoulders and no way out in sight, she didn't know if she could keep going. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't look. It buzzed a second time. A third. A fourth. Cassie reached to decline it, figuring it was a telemarketer or a debt collector, and she didn't have the strength to deal with anything right now. But the phone kept buzzing. A fifth time, stubborn and patient. She glanced at the screen. An unknown number. No name. Part of her wanted to throw the phone at the wall, but another part, the part that never stopped worrying about her mother, thought maybe it was the hospital calling from a different line. Maybe something had happened. Cassie pressed answer. She almost didn't. Almost. But something in her made her hit the green button. That decision changed everything. The voice on the other end was cold as ice, and so familiar it made Cassie's skin crawl. Cassandra Reyes. Cassie went rigid. She knew that voice instantly. The man from last night. The owner of Blackwood Tower. The one who'd thrown her out of his office only hours ago. Kieran Blackwood went on, his tone flat and emotionless, as if he were reading the weather. Blackwood Tower, 70th floor, 8 o'clock tonight. Alone. Cassie felt heat flood her face. I'm not a hooker. Find someone else. Kieran didn't even sound fazed by her refusal. He answered in the same cold voice, saying he didn't need a hooker. He needed a housekeeper. And she needed $150,000. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. Then the call ended. Cassie sat there in the hospital corridor, staring at her dark phone screen, trying to process what just happened. He knew about the money. He knew about her mother. But how did he have her number? And what did he want from her? She called Tiffany immediately and told her everything, from last night to the call that had just come in. Tiffany was quiet for a long time, then said, her voice more serious than Cassie had ever heard it. Cassie, that man's dangerous. Everyone in Chicago knows the name Blackwood. They're not just businessmen. There are rumors about that family. Rumors people don't say out loud. Cassie knew. She wasn't stupid. She'd heard the whispers about the Blackwood Empire, about shadow deals, about people who disappeared after they crossed them. But she looked through the window into the hospital room, looked at her mother lying there with paper, pale skin, and machines keeping her alive. And she told Tiffany she knew, but her mother was dying. What choice did she have? Tiffany didn't answer. There wasn't an answer. All day, Cassie worked at the diner like a machine, hands carrying plates while her mind was somewhere else entirely. She weighed every possibility, every option, every path. They all led to the same dead end. No one was going to loan her $150,000. No miracle was coming. There was only one door opening in front of her, and that door led straight to Kieran Blackwood. At exactly 8 that night, Cassie stood in front of the private elevator at Blackwood Tower. A security guard was already waiting, ushered her inside without a word, and pressed the button for the 70th floor. When the doors opened, Cassie stepped into a different world. Kieran Blackwood's penthouse was vast and cold, like a museum. Everything was minimalist. All white, gray, and black. Not a painting, not a flower, not a single sign that a human being truly lived here. Kieran stood by a massive wall of glass overlooking the city, his back to her, his tall body outlined against the shimmering lights of Chicago. He didn't turn right away, leaving her there to wait, as if she were nothing more than an appointment on his crowded schedule. Finally, he faced her, steel-gray eyes giving nothing away, and said he had an offer. She'd work for him, personally, as his housekeeper, his assistant, the one who handled his problems. Salary of $10,000 a month, and more than that, he'd pay all of Rose's hospital bills. All of it. No repayment required. Cassie felt her head spin. $10,000 a month, every hospital bill paid. It was an offer she couldn't refuse, and that was exactly why she knew something had to be wrong. She looked him straight in the eye and asked what she had to do in exchange for all that money. Sleep with him. Kieran looked at her like she'd just said the stupidest thing he'd ever heard. Then he spoke, his voice still cold but edged with something strange, and said he was disgusted by physical contact. He didn't shake anyone's hand without gloves. He didn't let anyone touch his belongings, and the very thought of intimacy with anyone he stopped. Didn't finish the sentence, but his eyes said the rest. It was the look of a man carrying wounds so deep they couldn't be healed. He went on, saying he needed someone to maintain his space. Someone who followed rules, someone who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Could she do that? Kieran laid out the terms. She'd live in the penthouse and have her own room. She had to be on call 24/7. She had to follow every rule he set, without exception. She wasn't to ask about his past, his work, or anything personal. The contract would run for 1 year. He set a thick stack of papers on the table in front of her, along with a pen. Cassie looked at the contract, looked at Kieran, thought of her mother in the hospital, waiting for a miracle Cassie couldn't deliver. She picked up the pen and signed her name on the last line. She'd just sold herself to the devil, but at least the devil paid well. And right now, the devil was her mother's only hope. The first few weeks in Kieran Blackwood's penthouse felt like living inside a golden cage. Cassie had a private room 3 times the size of her old apartment, with a mattress that felt like cloud, a marble-tiled bathroom, and a closet bigger than her former living room. But the penthouse itself was chilling in a way that got under her skin. Everything was white, gray, and black. Not a single painting on the walls, not one flower in a vase, not one family photo. It was like living in a museum, or worse, like living in a sterile operating room. On the first day, Kieran handed her a list of rules that ran 2 full pages. Don't touch his belongings unless it's necessary. Every item had to be placed in the exact spot, at the exact angle, not even an inch off. Cleaning followed a fixed schedule, not 1 minute early, not 1 minute late. No personal questions. And most important of all, no physical contact. Absolutely never. Cassie followed every rule perfectly. She wiped, cleaned, and arranged everything exactly the way he demanded. But while she worked, she watched. She watched Kieran wash his hands dozens of times a day, sometimes scrubbing so hard his skin turned raw and bled. She watched him check the front door locks 3 times before bed, counting out loud each time. She watched him barely eat, living on black coffee and work that stretched deep into the night. And she watched his eyes whenever he stood at the window, looking out over the city after dark, those steel-gray eyes empty, as if he were staring at something no one else could see, something from the past that still haunted him every second. One night, around 2 a.m, Cassie woke to noise from Kieran's room. A scream so ragged with pain it cut straight through the expensive soundproof walls. Nora, I'm sorry. Then silence. Cassie lay in the darkness of her own room, heart pounding, staring up at the ceiling. Who was Nora? What had Kieran done to her that he had to beg forgiveness in his nightmares? The next day, as Cassie walked down the hallway to get her cleaning supplies, she ran into Hayes, Kieran's head of security, a tall, middle-aged man built like a wall, his face hard and unreadable. Watched her with a measuring look. He said, "You're the cleaning woman who talked back to Mr. Blackwood." Cassie didn't flinch. She answered, "I'm the cleaning woman who doesn't beg." Hayes studied her for a long moment, and then the impossible happened. The corner of his mouth lifted, almost a smile. Hayes had seen countless powerful people tremble before Kieran Blackwood. Killers, politicians, billionaires, all of them lowering their heads. But this woman, this cleaning woman with nothing but her self-respect, had held her ground. For the first time in years, Hayes felt something that resembled respect. Another night, around 3 a.m, Cassie couldn't sleep and went to the kitchen for water. She pushed the door open and stopped short. Kieran was sitting there in the dark, on the chair beside the dining table. He wasn't wearing gloves, and in the faint light spilling in from the windows, Cassie could see red scratches along his hands, self-inflicted wounds. He'd just woken from a nightmare, his body still trembling. Cassie didn't ask. She didn't say a word. She only moved quietly into the kitchen, brewed a cup of hot tea, then set it down on the table about 3 feet away, not handing it to him directly because she knew he couldn't stand contact. Then she sat in the chair across from him. Silence stretched on. At last, Kieran spoke, his voice rough, asking why she didn't ask. Cassie asked back. "Ask what?" Kieran said. "About the nightmares. About Nora. About why he was sitting here at 3 a.m. with blood on his hands." Cassie looked at him and answered evenly that he'd tell her when he was ready. Or he wouldn't tell her at all. That was his right, and she was only here because of the tea. Silence again. Kieran said, in a tone that carried something almost like surprise, that everyone asked. Everyone wanted something. Cassie shrugged and said she'd already gotten what she wanted. Her mother's surgery was scheduled for next week, and the rest wasn't her business. Kieran looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, those steel-gray eyes weren't entirely cold. He said she was strange. Cassie shot back that he was rude. Everybody had flaws. And then the impossible happened again, for the second time that day. Kieran Blackwood almost smiled. Just the faintest lift at one corner of his mouth. Only a flicker, but it was there. That night, for the first time in years, Kieran Blackwood slept without a nightmare, and Cassie began to realize the monster everyone feared might only be a man who'd never been allowed to heal. 2 months had passed since Cassie stepped into Kieran Blackwood's world. Kieran had kept his word, paying every cent of Rosa's hospital bills without saying a single thing about it. The surgery went smoothly, and Dr. Patterson called with the news that it had been a success. The tumor had been completely removed, and Rosa would recover. Cassie stood in a private VIP hospital room she hadn't even known existed, watching her mother lie there with more color in her cheeks than she'd had in months. And she cried. For the first time in so long, they were tears of happiness. The nurse on duty told her a man had arranged to transfer Rosa into the VIP room and had fresh flowers delivered every day, but he'd requested his identity not be disclosed. Cassie didn't need to ask. She knew exactly who it was. Something subtle began to shift between her and Kieran. They still kept their distance, still obeyed the unspoken rules, but now they talked. Not only about work or cleaning schedules, but about other things. Short conversations in the kitchen late at night when neither of them could sleep. Kieran asked about her mother, about her childhood on the South Side, about the dreams she'd once had before life grew too harsh to hold them. And Cassie realized something strange. Kieran Blackwood, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, didn't know how to talk to people like a normal man. He asked awkward questions, hesitated mid-sentence, like a child learning to communicate for the first time. Like in all his 36 years, no one had ever sat down and truly talked with him. Then that night came. The night everything changed. Cassie woke to a terrible crash from Kieran's room. She ran to the door, pushed it open, and saw him sitting on the floor amid the shattered glass of a large mirror, his hands covered in blood, his eyes fixed on nothing with a kind of panic she'd never seen in him before. This time, Cassie didn't keep her distance. She stepped carefully through the glass, sat down on the floor beside him, close enough that he'd know she was there, but without touching him. And then Kieran began to speak, his voice trembling, breaking apart, as if these words had been locked inside his chest for 28 years and were only now finding a way out. He said he was 8, and Nora was 5, his little sister, a girl with 2 bouncing braids who followed him everywhere like a shadow. He said that day he'd wanted to show her a magic trick with matches, to make her laugh, but the flame had surged too fast, swallowing the room in an instant. He told her about his father, Patrick Blackwood, who'd run into the fire to save Nora, and how someone had dragged Kieran outside while he screamed to go back in. He told her about the moment the house collapsed, and his father and his sister never came out. Kieran's voice tightened. He said he stood there and watched them burn. He heard Nora screaming his name, Kieran, Kieran, and he couldn't do anything. He only stood there. Cassie sat in silence and let him talk. Didn't interrupt, didn't judge. Kieran went on, telling her about his mother, Margaret Blackwood, who hadn't been home when the fire happened. When she arrived, the house was nothing but ash. She looked at Kieran, an 8-year-old boy sobbing with soot smeared across his face, and she told him he'd killed them. He was a murderer. She wished he'd died in there instead of them. Then she left, went into a psychiatric hospital, and never came back. Kieran was raised by his uncle, taught the family empire, and became the mafia boss at 25. Cold, controlled, trusting no one, because every time he trusted someone, every time he loved someone, he lost them. He looked at Cassie with eyes full of pain and said he was a monster. Cassie didn't cry. She didn't pity him. She didn't recoil. She only met his gaze and said he'd been 8 years old, just a child. It had been an accident, not a crime. Kieran shook his head, insisting he'd killed them. Cassie said the fire killed them. The accident killed them, not him. Kieran said he was a monster, and Cassie told him monsters didn't have nightmares about the people they'd killed. Monsters didn't punish themselves for 28 years. Monsters didn't bleed. Then she did something no one had dared to do in all those years. She took Kieran's bloodied hand in hers, without asking, without hesitation. Kieran flinched, his body going rigid, but he didn't pull away. For the first time in 28 years, someone touched him, and he didn't feel like throwing up. He didn't feel like screaming. He didn't feel contaminated. They sat there in the dark, surrounded by broken glass, hand in hand, saying nothing. For the first time, someone had touched his scars and didn't run, and Kieran Blackwood, a man who controlled everything, felt something he'd thought had died a long time ago, for the first time in 28 years. Hope. 3 months after Cassie stepped into Kieran's penthouse, her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. Her mother was recovering well, and between her and Kieran, something had taken shape that she didn't dare name. But peace never lasted in Kieran Blackwood's world. One afternoon, while Cassie was wiping down the living room, the elevator doors slid open without warning, and a man walked in as if he'd been expected. He was a few years younger than Kieran, around 32, with sleek black hair, a face so handsome it looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, and a charming smile that could have made almost any woman soften. But Cassie knew the moment she saw him that something was wrong. Behind that easy smile, his eyes were ice-cold and calculating. He looked her up and down, then smiled, and said that so she was the famous cleaning woman, the one who'd made his brother forget how to be his brother. Cassie didn't answer. She simply kept working. He introduced himself as Connor Blackwood, Kieran's younger brother. That evening, when Kieran left for a meeting, Connor stayed behind in the penthouse and approached Cassie in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, that smile still in place, and said that if she ever got tired of the Ice King upstairs, he was a whole lot warmer. Cassie looked at him with a flat, unreadable gaze, and said she wasn't interested. Connor laughed and said everyone was interested, they just didn't admit it. Cassie replied that then she must be no one, excuse her, and started to move past him. But Connor stepped into her path and herded her into a corner. The smile slid off his mouth, replaced by something sharp and frightening, no less cold than Kieran at his worst. He told her he'd give her one truth about his brother. Kieran destroyed everything he touched, their father, their little sister, their mother, and he was cursed, and anyone who came too close got burned, in every sense of the word. Cassie held Connor's stare and asked if that was a threat. Connor smiled again, a smile that never reached his eyes, and said it was a warning. But if she was stupid enough not to listen, then yes, it was a threat. Then he left, and Cassie stood alone in the kitchen with her heart pounding hard enough to shake her breath loose. She understood, with a clarity that chilled her, that Connor didn't only hate Kieran. He wanted what Kieran had: power, money, an empire. And somehow, Cassie had become a piece on his board. A few days later, another woman appeared at the penthouse. She was breathtaking, with golden blonde hair, ocean blue eyes, and a blood-red dress clinging to a flawless body. She walked in like she owned the place, like Cassie was nothing more than an ant beneath her heel. She asked, in a haughty voice, where her fiancé was. Cassie stood there feeling like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water in her face. Fiancé. The woman introduced herself as Vanessa Sterling, and Cassie recognized the name instantly. The Sterling family was one of the most powerful mafia families in the Northeast, longtime allies of the Blackwoods. Vanessa explained, with a thin sort of contempt, that the wedding between her and Kieran had been arranged 5 years earlier, a contract between two families, not love, but business. Right then, Kieran stepped out of his office. Before he could say anything, Vanessa surged forward and kissed him in front of Cassie. Cassie stood frozen, as if someone had driven a fist straight into her chest, pain blooming so hard she couldn't draw a full breath. Then the unexpected happened. Kieran went still for a single beat, then shoved Vanessa away with open disgust on his face. He bit out that she was not to touch him. Vanessa stared, shocked, and asked why, because before this, he'd never minded when she did that. Kieran answered coldly that everything had changed, and the engagement was off. Vanessa's gaze flicked from Kieran to Cassie, and understanding flashed in those blue eyes. She screamed that Cassie was Kieran really breaking their alliance for a cleaning woman. Kieran didn't answer, and Cassie, even knowing he'd pushed Vanessa away, still felt betrayed. Not because of the kiss, because he'd never told her about this arranged marriage. For 3 months, the late-night conversations, the moments he'd opened himself to her, and he'd never once thought to mention he had a fiancé. Cassie told Kieran she needed to go see her mother, then stepped into the elevator without looking back. She needed time. She needed to think. She needed to get out of this place, even if only for a little while. Vanessa watched Cassie leave with a satisfied smile curving her mouth. She pulled out her phone and made a call, saying Connor, "It's Vanessa," and she thought they shared a common interest. The next day, Cassie was sitting in her old apartment, the one Rosa had moved back into after she'd fully recovered. Her mother sat on the sofa reading a book, color back in her cheeks, her smile back where it belonged. Seeing her like this, healthy and whole, Cassie knew she'd made the right choice when she'd signed a contract with the devil. But now her heart was breaking because of that very devil. The doorbell rang, and Cassie went to answer it. She froze when she saw Kieran Blackwood standing in the doorway of her small South Side apartment, his black three-piece suit looking almost unreal against the worn hallway with its peeling paint. For the first time in his life, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago had left his tower for someone. Rosa lifted her gaze to the unfamiliar man, then looked at her daughter with quiet understanding. She said she'd go to the bedroom, then rose and closed the bedroom door behind her. Kieran stepped inside, standing in the tiny living room, and somehow making it feel even smaller. He said the wedding with Vanessa was a business arrangement, not feelings, set up long before he'd ever met Cassie. He said he should have told her. He just hadn't thought it mattered. Cassie gave a bitter laugh and said it mattered because he'd hidden it. Then she went on, her voice edged with hurt, saying she was only his housekeeper, wasn't she? And he didn't owe her any explanation about his fiancé. Kieran's voice tightened as he said she wasn't his fiancé. He'd already called off the engagement. Cassie shot back, called it off for how long? Until the next business deal came along. Kieran looked at her with something like pain and said she didn't understand. Cassie snapped, telling him, then make her understand. Because from where she stood, she was just a contract, a convenience, someone who cleaned his penthouse and listened to his nightmares until he got tired of her. Kieran stood there, steel-gray eyes flaring with something she'd never seen in him before. He said, his voice shaking, that she was the only person who'd ever truly seen him, seen the real him, not the boss, not the monster, not the name Blackwood, just him, and she hadn't run. Did she have any idea what that meant? Did she have any idea how terrifying that was? Cassie opened her mouth to say she was only, but she didn't get the words out. Kieran cut her off with a kiss. Not gentle, not romantic, desperate, aching, hungry with want. For the first time in his 36 years, Kieran Blackwood reached for another person on purpose. Not because he had to, not because it was a transaction, because he wanted to. His mouth was hot on hers, his hand trembling as it cupped her cheek, and Cassie could feel the fear braided into the kiss, the fear of being refused, the fear of being abandoned, the fear he'd carried for 28 years. When they pulled apart, they were both shaking. Cassie whispered that this changed everything. Kieran nodded, saying he knew. Cassie said they couldn't go back to the way things were. Kieran looked at her with naked sincerity and said he didn't want to go back. Silence held between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something new and frightening. Kieran spoke again, his voice as light as breath, asking her to stay. Not as his housekeeper, not as a contract, just stay. She should have said no. She should have turned away. But when she looked into those steel-gray eyes, she saw something she'd never seen there before. Fear. Kieran Blackwood, the man who controlled everything, was afraid of losing her. And dear God, she couldn't turn away from that. 1 month after that first kiss, everything between Cassie and Kieran had changed. They weren't hiding what they felt anymore, at least not from each other. Kieran changed in ways so subtle only Cassie would have noticed. He washed his hands less than before, and he didn't scrub until he bled anymore. He slept more, sometimes even making it through the night without nightmares, if Cassie sat beside him. He still wore gloves when he went out, still hated being touched by other people. But Cassie was the exception. She was the only person who could touch him without gloves, the only person who could take his hand without making him flinch. Their relationship wasn't perfect. They still argued. There were still distances between them neither of them knew how to cross. Kieran was still closed off, still struggled to put his feelings into words. Cassie was still stubborn, still refusing help when it felt like pity. But they were trying, day by day, and that mattered more than anything. Then that morning came. Cassie woke to her phone vibrating nonstop on the nightstand. She reached for it and saw dozens of missed calls and messages from Tiffany. Beside her, Kieran's phone was buzzing too, relentless. Hayes called Kieran, his voice tight on the other end, saying, "Sir, you need to see this right now." Kieran turned on the television in the bedroom, and they both went still in front of the screen. Their faces were everywhere, on every news channel. A photo taken without permission, the two of them holding each other on the penthouse balcony, the city lights glittering behind them. The headline scrolling across the screen hit Cassie like a slap. Chicago's most dangerous mafia boss and his cleaning woman. Love story or filthy deal. The article dug up everything about Cassie. A picture of her in her worn cleaning uniform. Details about her mother's cancer, the crushing hospital debt, the fact that she'd worked 3 jobs at once. Poisonous comments flooded social media. Gold digger, high-end escort, from scrubbing floors to a billionaire's bed. And the article's conclusion drove into her like a knife. She sold herself to pay off her debt. Cassie's phone rang. Her mother, Rosa said, her voice shaking. "Honey, someone's pounding on our door. There are so many reporters outside, and the neighbors are looking at me like I'm a criminal." Cassie felt blood rush straight to her head. They weren't only attacking her, they were attacking her mother, a woman who'd only just survived and who had nothing to do with any of this. Kieran exploded. No, exploded still, wasn't enough to describe what happened. He shattered the glass side table with one blow, hurled the television remote into the wall, and roared into the phone at his men to find out who'd done this. Find out right now. Then he turned on Cassie, his eyes on fire, and said he'd destroy them. Every last one. He'd burn down everything they had. Cassie looked at him and felt a chill crawl up her spine. Not because she thought he'd hurt her, because the eyes staring back at her weren't Kieran's anymore. They were the eyes of the monster he'd always believed he was. The eyes of the man he'd become if she didn't stop him. Cassie shouted at him to stop. To stop right now. Kieran turned, his gaze still blazing with fury. Cassie told him not to become the monster they said he was. Not to do this for her. Kieran ground out that they'd hurt her, dragged her name through the mud, harassed her mother. Cassie shot back that if he destroyed them, he'd prove them right. He'd prove everyone had been right about him all along. Kieran looked at her with heartbreak written across his face and said, his voice splintering, that she didn't understand. He was a monster. He'd always been one. This was what monsters did. They burned everything they touched. And in that moment, Cassie saw it more clearly than she ever had. The real enemy wasn't Connor. It wasn't Vanessa. It wasn't the media. The real enemy was the voice in Kieran's head. The voice that had whispered to him for 28 years that he was a monster, that he destroyed everything he touched, that he didn't deserve love, and she didn't know how to fight that enemy. 2 days had passed since the scandal broke. 2 days in which Kieran didn't sleep, didn't eat, only sat in his office making call after call to his men, ordering them to find whoever was behind this. Revenge became his obsession the way hand-washing and lock-checking used to be. Relentless, compulsive, consuming. Cassie watched him through the frame of his office door, saw the bloodshot eyes from sleeplessness, the rough stubble he hadn't shaved, the way he was dismantling himself hour by hour, and she faced a truth that hurt like bone. She couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved, and she couldn't let her mother get pulled into this war. Rosa had already endured too much. She deserved peace, not reporters swarming her every time she stepped outside. Cassie made her decision. She stood in her room and packed her things into a small suitcase. There wasn't much to take. She'd come here with nothing but a few changes of clothes and a heart that was now in pieces. Footsteps sounded behind her, and Cassie didn't need to turn to know who it was. Kieran stood in the doorway, looking at the suitcase, and asked what she was doing. Cassie didn't turn around. She kept folding clothes and answered that she was leaving. Kieran said no. One word, cold and final, like every other order he'd ever given. Cassie turned to face him, her brown eyes steady. She told him this wasn't a question. She wasn't asking permission. Kieran stepped into the room, and there was a thread of panic in his voice he tried to bury. He'd fix this. He'd make them pay. Cassie cut him off and said that was exactly why she had to go. She stopped, looked into those steel gray eyes that were starting to fracture, and spoke the words she needed to say before she walked out. She told him she loved him. She loved the man who made tea at 3 a.m. and didn't know how to smile. She loved the man who'd paid her mother's hospital bills and pretended it was nothing. She loved the man who'd punished himself for 28 years over a mistake he'd made when he was only 8 years old. But she couldn't stand there and watch him destroy himself. She couldn't watch him become the monster his mother had named him. And she couldn't let her mother be dragged into a battle she'd never signed up for. Kieran stood there in silence. Cassie waited. She waited for him to say something. Anything. She begged him without words to speak, to tell her to stay, to tell her he'd stop, to say anything at all. But Kieran didn't speak, not because he didn't want to, because in his head, a voice was whispering that she'd be safer far away from him. Everyone he'd ever loved had been hurt. His father, his sister, his mother. And now, Cassie. He thought he was protecting her by letting her go. He thought his silence was the last gift he could give her. Cassie looked at that silence and understood it for what it was. An answer. She pulled the suitcase out of the room, walked past him, and set the penthouse key on the table near the elevator. She stepped inside, then turned back for one last look. Kieran stood there, his face carved into stone, not a flicker of expression, but his eyes. Those steel gray eyes were dying by the second. The elevator doors began to close. Cassie held his gaze until the steel slid shut, cutting the man she loved out of her sight. The doors sealed. And Kieran Blackwood, the man who controlled everything, stood frozen as the only person who'd ever truly seen him vanished from his life. He let her go. It was the most selfless thing he'd ever done. It was also the biggest mistake of his life. 3 weeks had passed since the day Cassie stepped out of that elevator and out of Kieran Blackwood's life. 3 weeks of trying to live normally, caring for her mother, looking for new work, pretending her heart didn't split open every night. News of Kieran reached her through Tiffany, who had sources in Chicago's mafia circles. Kieran was falling apart. He wasn't eating. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't running his business. He'd locked himself inside the penthouse and refused to see anyone. Connor was seizing the moment, step by step, taking control of the Blackwood empire, preparing a coup. And Vanessa Sterling was pressuring Kieran to agree to the marriage, using the family contract like a weapon. Cassie heard it all and felt like someone was squeezing her heart in a fist. One night, as Cassie sat on the sofa staring at nothing, Rosa sat down beside her. She looked at her daughter with the eyes of a mother who'd watched her child suffer for 3 long weeks. And she asked plainly if Cassie loved him, the man who'd saved her mother's life. Cassie didn't answer. She just broke, the tears she'd held back for 3 weeks finally spilling out. She told her mother everything, from the night she'd fallen asleep in his chair, to the contract, to the late-night conversations, to the first kiss, to the scandal, and the day she walked away. Rosa listened, silent for a long time, then spoke in a voice that was gentle but certain, saying that life didn't always give you perfect choices, and sometimes you had to fight for things that were messy, complicated, and frightening, because those things were worth it. He was worth it, and Cassie was too. Cassie lay awake all night turning her mother's words over and over, and she saw a truth she'd refused to face for 3 weeks. She hadn't left to save Kieran. She'd left because she was afraid. Afraid of losing him, afraid of his world, afraid of getting hurt. But fear wasn't a reason to abandon the person you loved, and if Kieran couldn't fight for himself, then she'd fight for him. Her phone buzzed. Hayes' number. Kieran's head of security had been secretly contacting her for 2 weeks, updating her and sending evidence he'd gathered. Hayes was loyal to Kieran, not to the Blackwood family, and he knew Connor was betraying him. Today was the day Connor was calling a meeting with the Mafia elders to formally declare Kieran unfit to lead. Cassie knew this was her one chance. The conference room on the 69th floor of Blackwood Tower was packed with the most powerful faces in Chicago's underworld. Connor stood at the head of the table, Vanessa seated beside him with a victorious smile, and together they were laying out their plan to take over the Blackwood Empire. Connor said his brother was no longer capable, that Kieran had let a cleaning woman drive him mad, and that it was time for new leadership. Right then, the meeting room door opened. Cassie walked in. Every head snapped toward her. Shock spread across every face. The cleaning woman. Here. Connor laughed and asked what she was doing there. Had she come to beg for her job back? Cassie didn't answer him. Calmly, she walked to the table, set a thick stack of documents in front of the elders, and said in a clear voice that didn't shake that Connor Blackwood wasn't trying to save this organization. He was trying to steal it. And Vanessa Sterling wasn't here for marriage but for power. And the proof was in their hands. The elders scanned the pages. Evidence that Connor had been selling information to a rival organization, secret transactions, recorded calls. Connor went pale, trying to argue, but no one listened anymore. One of the elders stood and told Connor he was finished, to get out. Vanessa shot to her feet, her face flushed purple with rage, and screamed at Cassie that she thought she'd won. She was nothing, just trash. She didn't belong in this world. Cassie met Vanessa's gaze and said yes. She didn't belong in this world, but she belonged beside Kieran, and he'd chosen her. And that was something all of Vanessa's money and power would never be able to buy. A voice came from the doorway. Kieran. He stood there, one shoulder against the frame, having witnessed everything. He looked thinner than he had 3 weeks ago, his eyes hollow with sleeplessness. But for the first time in 3 weeks, something alive had returned to those steel-gray eyes. He looked at Cassie, the woman who'd just saved him not with money or power, but with a courage he'd never believed she possessed. Cassie and Kieran faced each other in the middle of the room. Kieran said she shouldn't have come back. He was dangerous. Cassie said she knew. She didn't care. Kieran said he'd hurt her. Cassie said maybe, but at least they'd hurt together. Kieran pulled her into his arms, holding her tight like she was the only lifeline he had in a black sea. And for the first time in 3 weeks, for the first time in 28 years maybe, Kieran Blackwood cried. Kieran Blackwood had lived his whole life believing he destroyed everything he touched. But this woman, this stubborn, fearless, impossible girl, had walked into his fire and refused to burn. A month had passed since the day Cassie came back and saved Kieran from Connor's coup. Everything had shifted. Connor was cast out of the Blackwood family, stripped of every ounce of power and wealth, and rumor said he'd fled to Europe to hide from the enemies he'd made during his betrayal. Vanessa Sterling vanished from Chicago, but Cassie knew a woman like her didn't quit so easily. Kieran and Cassie were rebuilding what they'd almost lost, slowly and carefully, like two people learning how to trust from the ground up. Kieran had even started talking about therapy, a step Cassie never thought he'd take. Then that afternoon arrived. Cassie was reading on the sofa when the penthouse doorbell rang. Hayes came in looking more tense than usual and told Kieran someone wanted to see him, and she said she was his mother. Kieran shot to his feet, his face going pale like he'd seen a ghost. And maybe he had, because the woman who walked through the door was Margaret Blackwood, the woman who'd abandoned him 28 years ago. She was 62, her hair cut short and gone white, her body gaunt as if it were nothing but bone wrapped in skin, and her eyes filled with the ghosts of the past. She'd been released from the psychiatric hospital after 25 years, and now she stood here in her son's luxury penthouse, taking in the wealth around her with a bitterness that could sour the air. Margaret looked at Kieran. Then she looked at Cassie beside him. Then she turned back to Kieran, her eyes flaring with resentment. Cassie understood instantly who'd brought Margaret here. Vanessa. This was her final weapon, using the past to destroy the present, using the mother who'd left her child to break that child all over again. Margaret spoke, her voice cold and razor-sharp, saying, "Look at him, living in luxury, living happy. While she rotted in a psychiatric hospital for 25 years, he'd killed his father, killed his little sister. And he got to enjoy all of this." Kieran stood there without a single word. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, the man who made the whole underworld tremble, was trembling now like an 8-year-old boy in front of his mother. 28 years had passed, but he was still that child standing before the ash of his home, hearing his mother call him a murderer. Margaret turned on Cassie with open contempt and asked who she was. What kind of stupid woman loved a killer? Cassie stepped forward, placing herself between Kieran and Margaret. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Her voice was calm and sure as steel. She said she was the woman who loved Margaret's son, the son Margaret had abandoned. She said she understood Margaret's pain. She'd almost lost her own mother to cancer. She knew what it felt like to watch someone you loved suffer. But Kieran had been 8 years old when it happened, only a child, and instead of helping him heal, Margaret had called him a murderer, had looked at her own son with hatred, then left him alone to carry that guilt for 28 years. Margaret had lost her husband and her daughter in that fire, but so had Kieran. He lost his father. He lost his sister. And then he lost her, the only parent he had left. Margaret stood there as if she'd been struck across the face. And then tears began to slide down her cheeks. For the first time in 25 years, she looked at Kieran, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see a murderer. She saw a man who'd carried the scars she'd carved into him for his entire life. She said, her voice breaking, that she'd been drowning. Grief had swallowed her whole. She couldn't look at him without seeing them, without blaming him. She knew it was wrong. She knew she'd failed him. She just didn't know any other way to survive. Kieran looked at his mother, the woman who'd haunted him for 28 years, and at last he spoke. His voice shook, but he spoke anyway, saying he'd waited 28 years for her to come back. 28 years thinking maybe one day she'd forgive him, maybe one day she'd look at him and see her son instead of a monster. Did she know how many nights he'd woken screaming Nora's name? How many times he'd wished he'd died in that fire instead of them? The room fell into a heavy silence. Mother and son faced each other, and between them lay 28 years of suffering, 28 years of guilt, 28 years of resentment. But between them also stood Cassie, the woman who refused to let the past define the future. The weapon Vanessa had sent to destroy Kieran was about to become the key that freed him, because sometimes the only way to heal is to face the person who hurt you most. and choose forgiveness. Cassie watched mother and son facing each other, felt the weight of 28 years of suffering hanging in the air, and she knew this was a conversation they needed to have, just the two of them. She said softly that she'd be in the kitchen, and they could take their time. Then she stepped out and closed the door behind her, leaving Kieran and Margaret alone in the vast living room. Margaret lowered herself onto the sofa, her legs trembling so badly they could barely hold her, her hands clasped together as if it were the only thing keeping her from coming apart. Kieran walked to the wall of glass and stood there with his back to his mother, staring down at Chicago spread out below, his posture the same as the first time he'd met Cassie in that office on the 70th floor. Margaret spoke first, her voice rough and full of pain, saying she didn't expect him to forgive her. She didn't deserve it. She was his mother, and she'd abandoned him when he needed her most. Every day in the psychiatric hospital, she thought of him, wondered what kind of man he'd become, hated herself for not being there to see it. But she'd been broken, Kieran. The fire had taken everything from her husband, her little girl. And when she looked at him, she didn't see her son. She only saw flames. She only saw Nora's empty room. She only saw everything she'd lost. Kieran turned, those steel gray eyes filled with emotions he'd buried for 28 years. He said he'd lived for 28 years believing he was a monster because she'd told him he was. He'd built all of this. He swept a hand around the luxury penthouse because he thought if he was powerful enough, rich enough, in control enough, maybe he could outrun what he'd done. Maybe he could prove he wasn't only the child who'd killed his own family. But he never could. Because every time he closed his eyes, he heard her voice. "You killed them. You're a murderer." Margaret broke into sobs, saying she was sorry. She was so sorry. She hadn't meant it. She'd been out of her mind with grief. But that wasn't an excuse. There was no excuse for what she'd done to him. Silence stretched between them, heavy and aching. But something in the air was shifting too. Kieran said, his voice low and shaking, that he didn't know if he could forgive her. Margaret nodded and said she understood. Kieran went on, saying that he wanted to try, not for her, but for himself, because he was tired of carrying this. Margaret sobbed and said that was more than she deserved. She opened her handbag and pulled out an old photo album, the corners frayed and worn, the only thing she'd kept through 25 years in the hospital. She opened it, and pictures of a happy family appeared. Patrick with a wide smile, Margaret young and full of life, Kieran at 8 with bright eyes, and Nora at 5 with 2 braids and an angel's grin. All of them laughing, all of them happy, not knowing tragedy was waiting. Margaret pointed to Nora's picture and said the little girl's laugh sounded like bells, clear and joyful, and she adored Kieran. He was her hero. Kieran stared at the photo, his voice catching, and said he'd forgotten. He'd tried to remember, but he'd forgotten what her laugh sounded like. Margaret took her son's hand and said, "Then let her remind him. Let her tell him about Nora, about his father, about who they'd been before the fire." When Cassie returned to the living room a while later, she found them sitting side by side on the sofa, the photo album open between them, both of them crying. But they weren't tears of resentment anymore. Kieran lifted his gaze to Cassie, and those steel gray eyes were warmer than she'd ever seen them, more alive than ever, for the first time with no ghosts of the past hiding behind them. He gave her 2 words without speaking them. "Thank you." Forgiveness didn't erase the past. It couldn't undo the harm or bring the dead back, but it opened a door leading to a different future. And for the first time in 28 years, Kieran Blackwood stepped through it. 1 year after the night Cassie fell asleep in Kieran Blackwood's chair, the two of them walked into the office on the 70th floor, the place where everything began. The room looked the same, spotless, precise, floor-to-ceiling glass framing Chicago's lights like a living constellation. But something had changed. On Kieran's desk, where there'd once been only cold emptiness, there was a photograph now. A picture of them laughing. Kieran's arms wrapped around Cassie from behind, both of them looking straight into the camera with a happiness they couldn't hide. Real, not perfect, but beautiful. Cassie glanced around and said he'd kept that chair. Kieran nodded and said of course, that was where he'd found her, where everything changed. Cassie smiled and said it was also where he'd woken her up with a ruler and threatened to have her arrested. Kieran laughed. A real laugh, not forced, not controlled. The kind of laugh she'd never believed she'd see on that hard face a year ago. Rosa was completely healthy now, living in the apartment Kieran had given her, spending her days planting flowers on the balcony and cooking meals that Cassie and Kieran stopped by to enjoy every weekend. Kieran was in therapy, and when Cassie asked how it was going, he frowned and said it was awful. Uncomfortable. He hated every second of it. Cassie asked if he was going to quit. Kieran shook his head and said he'd go back next week. Margaret and Kieran were rebuilding their mother and son relationship, meeting once a month, calling once a week, slow but steady, because 28 years of grief couldn't be healed overnight, but they were trying, and that was what mattered most. Connor had been exiled from the family, and word was he was somewhere in Europe, living off the last scraps of money he had left, and Vanessa had vanished completely. No one knew where she was, and no one cared. Kieran pulled Cassie down into the Italian leather chair with him, the chair that had witnessed the beginning of everything. He said that a year ago, she'd fallen asleep in that chair, desperate, exhausted, alone. Cassie laughed and said, "And then you woke me up with a stick." Kieran corrected her, saying it was a ruler. And look at where they were now. She was here because she wanted to be, not because of a contract, not because of money. Cassie asked, "So what now?" Kieran said, "Then make a wish." Cassie closed her eyes and thought of everything that had happened over the past year. Her mother surviving, Kieran healing, Margaret coming back, a love built out of wreckage. She opened her eyes and said she wished for more moments like this. More growing up, more healing, more love, more days where they kept learning how to live together even when life was messy, difficult, and frightening. Kieran smiled and said that was a good wish. Cassie asked if he could help her make it come true. Kieran kissed her softly and whispered that he'd already started. Love isn't perfection or control. Love is choosing to grow together, even when everything's messy and hard. Love is finding someone who makes you want to heal. Not because they fix you, but because they make you believe you deserve healing. And sometimes, just sometimes, the worst day of your life leads you to the best thing that ever happened to you. This story reminds us that no one is perfect. Everyone carries scars and wounds, but what matters is how we choose to face them. We can let the past define us, or we can choose to step through pain and search for healing. True love isn't finding a perfect person. It's finding someone willing to grow with you through the hard parts. If this story touched your heart, please tap the like button and share it with the people you love, the people who need to be reminded that they deserve love and happiness. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next moving stories. We'd truly love to hear what you felt, what this story made you think of in your own life. Have you ever lived through moments that felt hopeless, only to find light later? Share with us in the comments below. We want to read the stories that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.